Hamatakyapi, Napi Chuzapi, Chante Washte. My name is Nick Estes, and today I want to talk to you all about counterinsurgency and Indigenous resistance. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about a quote that I heard from former Indigenous president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, who said that the recent discovery of Native children's graves in Canada was, quote, part of a policy of extermination of the Indigenous movement. He further stated that the policy had been extended to, quote unquote, exterminate the proceso de cambio, or the process of change in Bolivia, referring to the 2019 US and Canadian-backed coup against his administration, which was democratically reelected for an unprecedented fourth term. Morales sees something that often goes unremarked in North America. If Indigenous people are talked about at all, it's often as victims, hapless victims, to be exact. Certainly not as part of a global movement or viable political or social alternative to the current model of exterminationist settler colonialism and U.S. imperialism and capitalism. But in many instances, that's exactly how Indigenous nations are viewed, especially when we go back and look at history. And it's also important to remember that what Morales is saying is something that has often been pointed out in the Indigenous movement, at least going back to the Red Power era, that there's a critical dialectic between foreign and domestic policy. And when I teach a course called The U.S. War on Terror, I begin often where students don't think the U.S. War on Terror begins, which is actually with the Indian Wars. So why would I start with the Indian Wars, and what do the Indian Wars teach us about this current moment? And thinking about not only boarding schools, but also the extractivist economy of both Canada and the United States. So one place to look is the battle streamers of the U.S. Army. There are actually 14 battle streamers on the U.S. Army flag that go from 1790 to 1891 in the United States' longest military campaigns, culminating with the final battle streamer, which is called the Pine Ridge Campaign. And that resulted in the 7th Cavalry's massacre of 300 Indigenous people, Lakota people, at the Wounded Creek in 1890, in December of 1890. And so when we think about this, the Indigenous peoples are unique in that they were once considered an external foreign adversary, the subject of counterinsurgency campaigns that later became, quote unquote, domestic internal peoples. So we see this transition of direct military campaigns into ones that are more kind of reservation based, right? And part of that were the implementation of things such as the civilization regulations that were enforced not only by Indian agents, but the creation of domestic police forces and federal laws implemented on reservations themselves, and the assertion of federal jurisdiction over Indigenous people. So at the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th century, you had about 84% of Native children in the U.S. attending boarding schools. Meanwhile, you have about 270 million acres of territory, which is about the size of the state of Montana, that was allocated as surplus land, right? And in this particular moment in time, the boarding school policymakers and promoters were targeting Native children because they understood that if they took Native children off the reservation, that it would force the hand of their parents to cede more land and to adopt the Dawes allotment policy, which essentially implemented a form of private property ownership that was put into trust. And since Native people weren't using a large part of this land, quote unquote, it was basically allocated for white settlement. So 84% of Native children put into boarding schools in what could only be called a form of hostage taking. And that's actually the language that these policy promoters used. They did call these children hostages for the quote unquote good behavior of their parents, and the cession of 270 million acres of territory. So this really gets into the heart of the matter, that the counterinsurgency campaigns waged against Indigenous people aren't, merely because they hate our language or culture or for us being, a certain or different race of people, but it always goes back to the land itself. We are racialized and we are made to disappear to make it easier to access the land. And if we look at that in the contemporary kind of moment and thinking about the global climate justice movement, and thinking about it specifically in North America, in the belly of the beast, and why this relates to places like Bolivia, which attempted to delink itself from the global commodity supply chain in service to the imperialist powers of Canada and the United States. Canada being the home of 60% of the world's mining corporations, and of course the United States implementing aggressive belligerent policy to maintain a fossil fuel economy, thus subjugates a lot of different places. And now we're obviously in a different kind of transition era. I don't have time to get into all of that and the policies of green energy transition, but nonetheless, it's important to point out that both Canada and the United States puts out about 1.7 billion metric tons of CO2 emissions a year. And if we quantify that, and we think about Indigenous-led movements against fossil fuel infrastructure, we can point to, if we add it all up, it's about 27%, it challenges about 27% of that 1.7 billion metric tons, right? So Indigenous people in Canada and the United States, although we're minorities of minorities within our own homelands, nonetheless play an outsized role in challenging carbon emissions, right? And if we think about that in terms of actual power, right, it's about 444 coal-fired power plants. That's more than all coal-fired power plants left in the United States. That's about 324 million passenger vehicles, more than all vehicles currently on the road right now, right? That's how much energy, that's how much carbon emissions that are currently being challenged in places such as the Dakota Access Pipeline, which puts out about 101 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, or the recently defeated Keystone XL pipeline, which was proposed to put out about 180 million tons of carbon emissions. And then if we look currently at struggles that are happening in northern Minnesota and Anishinaabe territory, Line 3, there's about 193 million metric tons of carbon emissions that are being challenged. This is a huge kind of this isn't just about, this is about land, but it's also about industry and money at this point in time. That's why we see, the states such as North Dakota using things such as the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which allows states to solicit support and resources from different federal agencies. We saw, I think it was around 73 different law enforcement jurisdictions from around the country descend on the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in 2016. I think altogether there were 91 different law enforcement agencies, which included things such as the Border Patrol and Homeland Security. And if we think about that in terms of today, South Dakota, even though the Keystone XL pipeline was defeated, much of the anticipated resistance was going to happen in South Dakota. And we saw this standoff that happened between the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, and the tribes in the western part of the state, of which I'm a part of. And in recently released documents that have been uncovered, the National Guard, sheriffs, county, deputies, and the state police and Department of Criminal Investigation in South Dakota came up with an emergency plan to police the Keystone XL pipeline protests, mostly led by Indigenous water protectors. In these plans, National Guard officials, they promote the use of deadly force. This is a direct quote from their released documents. Use of deadly force to protect pipeline infrastructure, right? And this is specifically targeting Indigenous water protectors, right? And if we look at the Minnesota kind of example right now. I mean, excuse me, before we look at the Minnesota example, it's also worth pointing out that Governor Noem, recently described a transaction between a billionaire, Willis Johnson, who's a major Republican donor, handed over $1 million basically to the state of South Dakota so that they could send a National Guard contingent to the Texas border with Mexico, because both Texas and Arizona have used the Emergency Management Assistance Compact to call upon other states, which South Dakota has responded with the support and backing of this billionaire. So the kind of the direct kind of oversight of corporations and the use of National Guard and law enforcement is very direct in that specific case. But in northern Minnesota, as Eileen Brown from The Intercept recently wrote, examples of police cooperation with energy firms such as Enbridge, who's building the Line 3 pipeline, aren't really hard to find. There's an escrow account with local sheriff's departments that allows for the company, the oil company, the energy company to donate to offset policing costs for basically policing these particular pipeline companies. The Minnesota Public Utilities Commission created the Enbridge funded account so that this time the pipeline company would essentially foot the bill for policing these specific protests. And so when we think about this in terms of what it means for the long arc of policing and military aggression and the kind of imbrication of the U.S. war on terror, the kind of definitions between domestic and foreign insurgency, as well as corporate and public, policing, it gets really blurred. And so this is something that I think is going to only, as time progresses, draw further contradictions and sharp distinctions between alternative views of what this planet or what this country should be in terms of decolonization and indigenous control of land bases. And at the forefront of it all, we're talking about indigenous people who are not only envisioning a world where indigenous sovereignty and livelihoods are centered and grounded, especially in relation to the land, but a world in which these resources are allocated to actually building up public infrastructure, as well as defending all the water and the land and the air that we all need to survive.